So let's get started. Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PIER Economics Seminar. My name is Don, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. It is our pleasure to welcome Professor Karsten from Maastricht University, Netherlands. Professor Mao is an associate professor of economics, specializing in international trade and economic development. And his research has been focusing on emerging economies. Today, he will be presenting his working paper titled Special Economic Zones and Firm Performance, Evidence from Vietnam. If you have any question during the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand. And also the Zoom attendees, please feel free to speak up. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Hello. Okay, very good. Yeah, thanks, Don, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming and for your interest in our paper. Yes, I'm really glad to be here. It's my first time in Bangkok and in Thailand in general, and I just had a wonderful lunch, and it's good to see that so many people are here and interested in this topic. So this paper is indeed a joint work with one of my colleagues, Tanja Trebisch, also from Maastricht University, and our joint PhD student, Trang, who's currently in her last year of the PhD and is going to submit soon. And this is indeed one of our joint projects in her work, in her thesis. So as you can see from the title already, the topic is about special economic zones, which is, I think, indeed a very popular or has become a very popular policy tools for policymakers to try to attract foreign capital, foreign knowledge into developing economies. Historically, special economic zones, I think, were targeted more at eradicating, as a place-based policy, at eradicating regional inequalities, but it has been discovered indeed also in the more like development economics context, indeed as a tool to attract foreign firms through various tax incentives or particular infrastructure and administrative services in a way that they can try to test various policy designs and experiment with different formats of policies to try to see which of them work out the best. So it's certainly easier to establish a place-based policy instead of having a countrywide liberalization of particular sectors or countrywide policies to try to attract and stimulate economic activity. So this is maybe more about the background. In general, when we are trying to evaluate special economic zones or place-based policies more generally, there's always non-negligible challenge in really observing and trying to see which mechanisms are at work. So it's very hard to figure out whether these policies are eventually effective, because there are many things that could, of course, confound the patterns and the developments that we are seeing in the data. But also often the data situation itself is very bad, so that there is no systematic collection of information about the policy design or the firms that are really affected by those policies or are benefiting from this. So that's why I think our contribution in this paper is really to make one step towards a direction where we have some more information about which firms are actually operating inside of economic zones, and which other firms that might not be operating inside those zones are perhaps nevertheless affected by this in a positive or in a negative way. So indeed, what we are doing in this paper, we are focusing on the case of Vietnam, which is also one of the fastest growing economies in the region in the past couple of years, and we are focusing in particular on the within firm performance of companies that are registered and operating in Vietnam in this time period, and we are trying to evaluate how those local firms are affected by special economic zones, either when they are operating inside of a zone, but also if they are operating in the neighborhood or in the vicinity of those zones. And then another attempt that we are trying to do in this paper, which is only suggestive, we cannot observe all the detailed transactions and ins and outs of those policies, but nevertheless, we are trying to improve a little bit our understanding of the underlying mechanisms that are likely to be operational. Let's admit more person. So the data that we are using, basically we are constructing a firm level panel data set that we are combining with geocoded location information on the special economic zones. And then we are matching basically this information to find out whether a firm is inside or just outside of a special economic zone. And then analytically or in the analysis, we are using, yeah, I think more or less state-of-the-art nowadays, staggered differences and differences, fixed effects specification to evaluate the causal impact. We want to know whether the existence of an SEZ leads eventually to a better performance inside the firm. Apologies. So what we're not doing in this paper, and that's maybe also something important to know, is that we're not looking at general agglomeration effects in the sense that we are trying to figure out if more firms move into that region. So we are really just looking at the firms that have been around before and that are still around after the SEZ has been established to see whether the firm itself grows. We're not looking at any interaction or any spillover effects or other agglomeration effects that would manifest in a more like a regional agglomeration. So we're really just looking at the within firm dimension. Yes, that's a summary of our main findings. We are to some extent surprised to find relatively strong and also non-negligible positive impacts of special economic zones on firm level employment, sales, and value added per worker. Value added per worker is used as a measure of productivity here. And we also find indeed significant spillovers to the local firms that are not operating inside SEZ boundaries, which is indeed, I think, one of the most important insights from the study, because this is, I think, what policymakers should eventually be after to see that there's the potential for a more sustainable development impact that goes beyond the SEZ boundaries and can stay also actually in the local economy. And then, of course, we'll look at heterogeneous effects, which I will explain in greater detail. So just to point out again the contribution that we are making in this paper, that's basically there's a large and indeed very quickly and dynamically growing literature that tries to evaluate special economic zones, sometimes also place-based policies in more general terms. But these are basically the papers that are most related to ours. And most of those papers have indeed the limitation that they don't know which firms are operating inside an SEZ. Because you cannot easily look inside them, right? So even if you use geocoded data, you can see, of course, there's a particular area where economic activity is increasing, but there are usually no systematic collection of data sets in data sets that report the SEZ status of a firm. And that is something that we are trying to do. And that's, I think, that has been done only in one other paper so far. This is the study by Holger Görg and Alina Mulyakova. In 2024, it was published in the European Economic Review, and they look at special economic zones in India, where they are finding quite sobering results that basically there was no positive impact, and sometimes even a negative impact on productivity because of, sometimes maybe wrong incentives that were set by those policies that lent more to rent-seeking behavior and did not really result in positive and productive spillovers. So our focus is indeed on Vietnam. And then this is maybe one other angle that we are trying to look at, and this has something to do a bit more with my background and more general interest in supply chain linkages. I think nowadays, whenever we talk about trade and international economics and also economic development, which are tightly related, because SEZs typically attract foreign capital, we also want to know something about global value chains, and then supply chain linkages become important. And also here, there's so far very little literature in the first place, but also evidence is very limited. There are a couple of studies on foreign direct investment in Europe. And some on multinational enterprises more generally in Latin America. But in the SEZ context, as I said, if you don't know which firms are there, it's also hard to know which industries are there. And we are trying to make a contribution also here. And then finally, I think that's maybe related also to your comment earlier, that Vietnam is indeed one of the current superstars in the regional economy. They're very fastly growing, and there's also really a growing literature studying those dynamics, and we are also contributing to this one. I think if you're interested in the employment effects on the SEZs that we are studying in this paper, I would recommend to you the recent Journal of Development Economics article by Tafesa and his co-authors, because they're looking indeed at the employment effects, and they find that there is an increasing migration, basically a sectoral migration from primary sector to secondary sector employment, in particular in those regions, and also a reduction in informal employment. And I think there are some additional insights to get out of this, of their paper, that are not covered in ours. Great. So this is the outline for the talk. I will give you a bit more of background and data information to the extent, and maybe also based on the qualifier that I've never been authorized to access the data myself. This has been done by our Vietnamese co-author Trang. She has access to the data. So I can rely mostly on what I know that is written on the slides and on what I know from the conversations with her. So for more specific questions, I will have to pass probably, and then the analysis, at the design of this, and the further results, and eventually the conclusions. So let's see how that evolves. Generally, special economic zones are not new in Vietnam. So since the early 1990s, one of the 5-year plans in Vietnam already targeted or developed ideas towards setting up specific processing zones or industrial parks, mainly in the big cities in the north and in the south, to stimulate economic activity by attracting foreign investment and capital. Then additional laws were passed and implemented and amended eventually on domestic investment promotion, but also on foreign investment law to really make the country and specific locations attractive to foreign capital and multinational enterprises, and always with the objective to stimulate also an economic transformation. Vietnam at the time, in the early 1990s, was probably still one of the poorest countries in the region and maybe even worldwide, mainly based on primary sector activities, and the ambition was really to try to industrialize and to use those laws to accelerate this trajectory. In those two graphs, I hope you can see them. You can probably not read the numbers here, but this is basically a timeline from the early 1990s to more or less, to 2019, where you can see the cumulative number of special economic zones that have become operational. And there were only a few in the 1990s. And then since the 2000s, basically also when Vietnam started to negotiate its admission to the WTO. It also negotiated a preferential trade agreement with the United States, and probably there were also other other developments. There has been really a pickup in the number of SEZs that have been founded, and we are really focusing on that time window since 2007, eventually in our data, where most of the dynamics are taking place. And here you see the spatial concentration of those SEZs. The darker colors means more special economic zones. And not surprisingly, they are, of course, concentrated in the north and south around the big superstar cities. But in principle, what we are trying to say with this graph is also that it's not only there are also other regions. So we can indeed, in our empirical analysis, exploit variation over time and across regions to identify the impact. So please, when questions, don't hesitate. So just to summarize, in this entire period here, we see slightly more than 400 special economic zones that have been formally established by the government. And those were established in 61 out of 63 different provinces of Vietnam. So just to tell you about the administrative division of Vietnam, there's basically the national level and then provinces. And after this, there are, I have it, I think, on one of the next slides. Maybe I do this later. There will be, I think, districts and communes eventually. And we are going to the commune level, so to the third level of the administrative division. So this is still relatively aggregated. Our analysis will be more detailed. So the designs of the policies, and this is indeed, on the one hand, this is, I think, the most interesting part usually in the analysis, but also one of the limitations that we are facing. We have no like SEZ specific information on the policy design. And the reality is, of course, that they are not just called SEZs. SEZ is like a general term for like a geographically confined area with like special or exceptional regulations, but they are actually called industrial parks, processing zones, border economic zones, high-tech zones, and so forth. And that means that they have different purposes and different tools that are implemented. Some examples, and the ones that we encounter most often, are those that target foreign firms. They offer tax deductions temporarily, customs exemptions, land rent exemptions, because the firms don't own the land; they just rent it from the government or the zone developers. There might be loan subsidies and also fiscal benefits for firms, but also for employees, actually. So there's a number of different tools which we unfortunately cannot disentangle. I think this would be something to improve in future research. But basically what we are assuming basically is that when a firm is inside an SEZ, it qualifies for certain mainly fiscal benefits, and this can have a positive impact on the performance of the firm. In comparison to other countries, I told you already that in high-income countries, the focus is usually a bit different, but I think that the design of SEZs in Vietnam is very similar to the one that we have found in China in the past, that basically these are centrally planned projects. Sometimes they're, of course, developed in partnerships with like semi-public and semi-private organizations, but the acquisition of the land and the distribution, I think, and the licensing is done under central supervision, and they often serve as test laboratories for specific policy designs to minimize, on the one hand, the risk that things are going wrong in the very bad way, but also to make it more manageable, and it's of course also less costly to set up than having like a countrywide infrastructure investment rollout. In contrast to the case in India, which is the study that found like these non-effects or maybe negative effects of SEZs, I think here one of the main differences that we found in the description of the policy designs was indeed that this worked more like a general license systems where firms could apply to without requiring them to rent land from the government, to relocate. So basically you could just register as a single firm, you could register as a special economic zone in the very location where you're already at. And that would usually give the firm, let's say, very easy benefits without a lot of commitment or checks and balances in the performance afterwards. And this is, I think, what the authors of the study I cited earlier and also here, indeed, what they argue is the reason why it did not work so well in India. So just to summarize, the way the SEZs in Vietnam are working is basically as a tool to attract FDI and boost economic growth. There are a number of different mechanisms. So of course, it's about learning from foreign firms through observation. So basically the co-location, seeing what they are doing, how they're doing things. There might be buyer-supplier relationships. Local firms supply to multinationals or vice versa. There can be these fiscal and infrastructure benefits that are working for firms inside of SEZs, but not outside of SEZs. This can be important, of course, to the extent that the effects can have different magnitudes. But there can also be negative effects of SEZs because there might be more competition on the labor market, and there might be also competition in some product markets if the SEZ firms are competing with local firms, right? So we're not investigating those, but I think this is also something I would like to do in the future to look a bit more at the general equilibrium effects. to give you already a taste of the data and the structure, I think in terms of like this very generic objective of attracting interesting and relevant foreign capital, we can see indeed here in the summary statistics that the types of firms, like in the sectoral operations of firms, affiliation of firms that are operating inside of SEZs or outside are quite fundamentally different. So just look here at the first and the second column in the manufacturing sector. You see that most firms in Vietnam that are outside of SEZs are not in manufacturing. They're mainly in services industries here at the bottom. That's 2/3 of the firms. Whereas in the SEZs inside, we see that most of the firms are actually manufacturing firms. So this is a clear sign that they're attracting firms that do stuff that are not usually done in the country. And even within the manufacturing sector, you can see that typically there is a tendency that the firms inside SEZs are operating in, let's say, potentially more technologically advanced and knowledge-intensive activities, which is not the case for manufacturing firms, at least not so much for manufacturing firms in the rest of the country. On top of this, we can also see that the fraction of foreign firms is also concentrated inside of special economic zones. So in this respect, already the prerequisites are fulfilled. We got the right firms. Let's see if they also have an impact. So to do this, to evaluate this, we have to find data on the SEZs. So we collect those data, and then we have to have also information on the firm, and then we have to in it. So this is the slide that tells you, or that explains how we're collecting information about special economic zones. So as I said, at the commune level, we manually, well, not we, actually Trang manually collected special economic zone information at the commune level for this period. She does that by looking into annual reports of the Ministry of Foreign Investment and Planning of Vietnam. She looks into government laws and regulations and additional news sources to basically come up with a list of all those different economic zones, and then also knowing the location of those zones at the commune level. So this is here the administrative division. So we have provinces, districts, and then wards, communes, which is usually, I think, a part of a city, I would say. So let's a province, district, or communes, and then within that you have villages, but we don't have this. We have this level here of observation. So it's pretty disaggregated. Then once we have this list, we want to know, sorry.
So you define like whether the commune is a special economic zone or not. Or within the commune, you have like partial.
Yeah, exactly. The latter is true. So this is just the first step to collect where SEZs are, and then we look more in detail whether the firms that we observe that are in the same commune, whether they're actually inside an SEZ or outside. So we can make this distinction because the surface of a commune is larger than the area of the special economic zone. Okay, this comes on the next slide, I think. But first, we want to know whether those special economic zones are actually also operational. So we double check this list. We don't trust that this is the whole story. We want to know whether this has actually turned into operation. And doing so, we go to Google Earth History for like imagery inspection using these historical satellite data, where you can really kind of go back in time to see how surface build up services and build up structure were appearing and growing over time in the area. And this is, I think, a particular feature of these Vietnamese special economic zones, because they're usually built on previously like idle land, or at least land that was unbuilt area beforehand, right? So sometimes it actually converts lands from nature or agricultural land into industrial land. But this makes it very easy to track visually with the satellite images. One caveat with this is, of course, that those images certainly don't go back to 1991. So already in 2007, we were encountering some issues there, that some were difficult to detect just because the images were not available. So in this case, we would have to go further to look more closely in those cases at the official government records and publications on whether this is operational or not. So there we really also had to look into newspaper sources, because what we want to know is not only whether the SEZ is operational, but also when the operations have started, more or less. So we want to have a year in which a particular SEZ became operational, which is usually the time when we can see that structures are being built. Yes, indeed. So this has basically two advantages. It gives us, I think, a relatively nice degree and good degree of reliability of this measure on the first place. And it also equips us with a potentially nice identification tool, because we will see that some of those SEZs in that list do not appear in the confirmation. So we basically have like these non-realized SEZs, which gives us a way at least to tentatively address like endogenous selection and self-selection of SEZs, so that basically location of an SEZ is not random. It probably follows a certain decision process, and by knowing those that were declared as suitable areas for SEZs, but that they didn't work out eventually, is basically a tool of identification and gives us a control group we are going to use in our analysis. So overall, in the end, we have about 300 SEZs, and yeah, here maybe also Don also had the question already when we talked earlier today. Unfortunately, I cannot give you the exact numbers of SEZs here, and especially not the numbers of SEZs that were cancelled. But I think more or less in proportions, I think it will be at maximum 10% that are the ones. So it's a bit unproportional here. The sample size. Okay, so this is about the SEZs, and now about the firms. The firm level data is basically from a, I think, very standard collection by the General Statistics Office of Vietnam, annual enterprise survey, where eventually all registered and public, formally registered firms in Vietnam are recorded. Clearly, there is an informal sector in Vietnam. That's very likely. We cannot observe this. This is a limitation. But since we're looking at the within firm effects, I think that might be also fine. And the one other aspect, of course, is that in order to observe firms over time, we have to rely on certain variables that also are consistently reported, which is the tax identifier, the tax ID of the firm. And this works reliably only from 2007 onwards, so that the very early years of special economic zones are not in our sample. But as you saw on the previous graph, most SEZs were founded in or after that year. So we still get most of the SEZs into our sample. So then we have additional information. So we know the firm type, whether it's state-owned, foreign, or privately owned. We know the industry affiliation of the firm, which is also very useful for the buyer-supplier linkages eventually. And we also have the address information of the firm. There's more information. Also, the name is usually there. So we can check the location of the firm's headquarters. So since it's a tax ID, it's a firm level data. It's not a planned or enterprise or establishment level. So it's just a firm that's, yeah, maybe a measurement problem that arises here, but nevertheless, we know the address information, and that's probably the one that is relevant when you want to have fiscal benefits from operating inside an SEZ. So this address information combined with the self-reported residence inside of an SEZ is basically what tells us whether a firm from a particular commune is actually operating inside or outside the SEZ boundaries, right? And that's nice because we have a very geographically granular picture of which firms are exposed to SEZs, which are inside and which are just outside those boundaries. And that's indeed something that enables us to differentiate between the performance of that are potentially in response to the SEZ specific benefits. They only accrue to the firms inside, and the spillovers to those that are outside. Sure.
Okay, just the first point that you have, the number of employees. You said that yet many report less than 10 employees. How do you know that, and how would that affect the model of a firm that you are looking for?
Yeah, so that was a bit of a curious finding in our data. So basically, the enterprise survey is mandatory only for firms larger than this number of employees. But what happens in reality is that indeed we have many firms that report less than that in the survey. So we have also a bunch, actually a very large number of firms that has less than 10 employees. And we don't know why they are reporting, but they're doing it for some reason. If they were not in the sample, of course, we would miss also, in addition to the informal firms, a large fraction of the economy. But here it's just there to emphasize that the data is a bit more complete than it seems from the requirement of firms to participate in the survey. Great. Okay, so based on this on this information for the firms, we can basically have three ways of being exposed to special economic zones for a firm. Either you're directly exposed, that means direct treatment is if a firm from a commune C is found inside the SEZ boundaries, and that it, no, sorry, we have a firm in a particular commune C, and after the, so it's there already before the SEZ became operational, and after the SEZ appeared in that commune, in the same commune, we find in our data here, it physically moved into that SEZ. So this is then a directly treated firm. There's certainly a problem with self-selection, but we are trying to mitigate that at least to some extent. Then there's indirect treatment. It's still the firms from a particular commune that is there already before the SEZ becomes operational, but it does not move into the SEZ. It just stays where it is. So this is the indirect treatment. They are potentially exposed to those spillovers. And then there are the non-treated ones. That means these are firms that are not in those communes where SEZs are, and also not where there to be SEZs in the future, as far as we know from our data, and also not firms that are in communes where SEZs had been established before 2007. So these are like never treated firms, right? So this is our default or baseline control group. Yes, or our potential control group at least. Yes, and then there are some issues, of course, with endogeneity. So in particular with the direct treatment, it might be that firms kind of self-select into SEZs. We don't have very strong tools to mitigate this, so we have to inspect very well whether there are pre-trends or other characteristics. For the indirect treatment, I think we are relatively fine in terms of self-selection. Then it's mainly about addressing the issue that the location of an SEZ is not random, and then more from a like a technical aspect, econometrical challenge is of course that the rollout happens gradually. So this calls for more advanced inferential methods than the standard differences and differences analysis that you would usually apply if you just have one moment of treatment. Okay, and now I'm trying to explain you how we do this. So just to go back, we want to understand whether and how SEZs have an impact on firm performance. The dependent variables that we are focusing on are only three. So we have the number of employees, all in log terms. We have the sales of the firm, so the revenues, basically operation revenues, and then we have as a measure of productivity value added per worker to see how much value added is created per employee. It's an imperfect productivity measure, but it's one measure that we can easily construct, and it's widely used as well. And then we have a variable of interest, of course, is the SEZ treatment. So we estimate different specifications where we regress each of these variables separately on either direct treatment or indirect treatment. And we each time compare it to the non-treated firms. So the control group is always the same, whether we focus on direct or indirect treatment. me see how I'm doing time-wise. I still have 20 minutes. Okay, good. So major challenges for identification is basically, on the one hand, the endogeneity of special economic zone locations. So this is a bit tricky because, of course, there are certain selection criteria for this, and what we have a number of different tools or attempts to mitigate this, and the most obvious one is indeed the one with the cancelled SEZs as a control group, because basically those are the ones that had already been selected by the administration as suitable. But then eventually they did not realize, so this is basically a perfect control group for those that are not treated but had been selected as eligible. It could also, of course, be that the cancellation is non-random, but that's basically what we have here at the current stage of this paper. Then another attempt to mitigate this would be a propensity score matching technique, and that is basically trying to estimate a binary outcome variable for a commune, whether it is likely to become an SEZ commune or not, and we use a bunch of variables to try to predict that outcome, which can be the size, the relative location to other cities, and maybe also the industrial base or the workforce. So there are a number of variables that we can use to estimate the probability of becoming an SEZ location, and then have a more balanced or matched sample in our control group. And then what we are doing eventually also, and I think that's a very strong tool but also straightforward tool, is to use a staggered diff and diff approach where we can compare not only the average effect of SEZs on those outcomes, but also how this effect evolves over time, so we can kind of observe those outcomes before and after the SEZ has been established. So these are the pre-trend diagnostics. Yeah, that's the staggered diff and diff estimator. I think, maybe when you're doing microeconometrics, you might be familiar with this. There has been, and it's still a very fast developing literature in econometrics that kind of raised the point that if you have like sequential treatments, so you have to take care of your control group. Because otherwise, if you use a standard conventional diff and diff estimator, it can be that your previously treated units are becoming part of the control group in later treatments, and that would lead to a downward bias in your estimates. So that's why we are employing the staggered diff and diff estimator. I think the most famous one is the estimator that has been developed and promoted by Callaway and Santana, which also has a number of ways of selecting the control group. We eventually preferred the more recent, I think it's called the extended two-way fixed effects estimator by Jeff Wooldridge, which has, as you can say from the name, the property that you can easily include also high-dimensional fixed effects into the model, which is something that we need in our specification. So eventually we have a regression equation that looks like this. We have our dependent variable here, which is employment sales or value added per worker. Then we have a bunch of like time-specific coefficients that we are estimating pre-treatment. So year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 before the treatment, and then year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 after the treatment. And then we have firm fixed effects and year fixed effects. And we are clustering our standard errors at the commune level, which is the same dimension as the treatment. And then in other specifications, we also have slightly other fixed effect structures. And on top of this, I think we also use some controllables. You cannot see them here, but we also control for firm size effects, and I think industry time fixed effects. To show you the results, these are basically the relative changes in employment, sales, and labor productivity for firms that are operating inside an SEZ. So after they moved into a special economic zones, the number of their employees on average in the years after they entered has been grown by 18 percentage points relative to other firms in the control group. The sales are growing by 50%, and also labor productivity is growing quite substantially. So these are, I would say, very large effects, and we don't know whether they come from the fiscal benefits or just because of additional, of a larger market access. That's not really clear where this comes from, but these are basically our baseline effects here. Using these canceled SEZs as our control group. When we use our general sample basically as a control group, we get very similar coefficients here. So the direct correlation, like relation between being in an SEZ and those outcome variables seems to be very strong and positive. When we're looking at the indirectly treated firms, and I think this is the more interesting part, we have also, of course, much more modest coefficients, like quantitatively smaller coefficients, but also very stable and statistically significant ones, suggesting that if you are operating outside of an SEZ but nearby of it, then your employment increases on average by 7% relative to firms that don't have an SEZ nearby, which is, I think, quite a sizable effect also on employment numbers. So this is within firms, right? Always within firms. And also the sales increased by 29% and productivity by 8.5%. So here we see, I think, that using this control group with the never treated firms in the canceled special economic zone regions, those effects are more modest than the ones that are estimated here. They're typically a bit larger. So there come a couple of robustness checks. Maybe I can try to go quickly over those. I think the main takeaway from those are that if you look in the upper panel, these are all the direct effects, so always the firms inside of SEZs. So here we have a bit of problem that there might be indeed those pre-trends. It's not here, not so much, but here and here there seem to be pre-trends. So there is indeed an issue with self-selection. That's at least what I take away from this. But when we're looking again at the indirect effects, they are, I think they are very strong, in particular for employment and for sales and value added per worker. That's a bit less clear. But those here seem to strongly support a causal relationship, I would say. The results will be similar with propensity score matching. I will not show the details now. We can talk about this later, but maybe you can also just read the paper if you're interested in those. And we do also some alternative specifications with subsamples. And indeed, we find, I think, in those subsample analysis that Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, like the SEZs there seem to be driving some of the spillover effects. So agglomeration, or pre-existing agglomeration, seems to make those SEZs a bit more effective than SEZs maybe in the middle of nowhere, where it's very hard to initiate agglomeration dynamics. Okay, so some further results, and then I think I will already have to come to an end soon. So we're looking at heterogeneous effects. So we have different dimensions here that we try to distinguish. The types of SEZs is not so interesting as long as we don't know what the differential policy tools are, but we see that indeed most of the the results are most robust within those so-called industrial zones. And I think what is maybe a bit more interesting are the ones here, the two here in the middle, the firm size and the type of firms. So in the firm size effects, I don't know if I can click on those buttons here. Is that possible? Okay, great. So this is basically estimated the same equation for firms of different size groups. So we first look at very small firms with less than 10 employees. We see that they mainly benefit in terms of employment and sales when they are located nearby SEZs. The within effects are very small and also very noisy, and this has to some extent also to do with the fact that very, very small firms actually go to SEZs, right? So most firms are larger firms that are inside, but we see that indeed the small firms seem to benefit indeed, in particular in terms of sales and employment. The productivity here is not significant. For the small and medium firms, it's also not extremely systematic, but we see that they generally increase their sales, And then the employment and productivity effects, it depends a little bit here. And for the large firms, we see that only the sales are increasing actually. So what that we can conclude from this slide here that most of the employment effects are concentrated among the smaller and medium-sized firms. Sales seems to be something that materializes across the board, and productivity effects seems to materialize a little bit more about the medium and smaller sized firms. Right, now we can go back. Thanks. Okay, right. And then maybe we can also look at the state-owned and foreign-owned ones, just to have a look also there. I think this will know the one above. Yeah. It's probably not so super surprising that in the bottom panel you see that there's very small observation numbers. There are not many state-owned firms, like purely state-owned firms in Vietnam in our sample, but they don't benefit a lot unless they are in terms of their sales and they're inside of an SEZ. But that's kind of the standard pattern that we find also in many other studies, that typically privately managed firms are following those market mechanisms most evidently. And what is, I think, also nice to see is, of course, that also many domestic privately owned firms are benefiting, and not only the foreign firms. Okay, thanks. Right. The last one, that's maybe something that is that's a classification that is a bit maybe less familiar. This Pabbitt's taxonomy. This is basically a taxonomy or a sector classification that tells you where innovation in an industry is coming from. So there are some mature industries. So very mature industries are, for instance, textiles and furniture and things like this. These are industries. The innovation typically is not made by the producers of the furniture or the manufacturers of the furniture, but mainly by the input supplying firms. So this is basically where maybe material sciences and so on are playing a role to add innovation to the products. And in contrast to that, we have science-based firms that would be maybe pharmaceutical firms, where innovation is typically more concentrated within the firm itself, and not necessarily depending so much on the supplier. So this is there is some distinction that we are finding there as well, and we find indeed that the supplier-dominated firms, these are the ones that benefit most from the spillovers. That can probably be the case because they're strong local linkages, and then we see that there are direct benefits often for the science-based firms. But if you remember from the overview chart, from the overview table in the beginning, we see indeed that those SEZ firms and foreign firms are typically the ones that are operating in medical or pharmaceutical sectors. So that's probably why we see them also here being a bit more dominant. Okay, then maybe very quickly about the mechanisms. So we can see that there are some positive effects on employment, sales, and labor productivity. And we want to find out what potential mechanisms could be for these direct and indirect effects. And we can only guess, or we cannot directly observe the transactions between firms that are taking place. And that's why we have to construct ways to infer this more or less directly or indirectly. And one I think very interesting channel is indeed this input-output linkages, that basically the firms that are locating inside of an SEZ are demanding inputs from local firms, or that they are selling inputs to local firms. We're looking at the upstream mechanism, that firms that are operating in an SEZ are demanding inputs from other firms that are already there, right? And to do this, we construct a measure, like an industry-specific measure of like SEZ-specific demand that we are constructing based on the general firm structure inside an SEZ. And this is something that requires a bit care in terms of the construction. So our sample so far has been firms that were in a particular commune before and after the SEZ was established. But of course, inside an SEZ, there are many firms that just came when the SEZ was established. So they were coming from outside. So we are looking at those firms that came from outside, and so at those like non-previously resident firms. We look at their industry structure, and we look at kind of their relative concentration inside the SEZ, so that to get an idea of what is happening in an SEZ by the majority of firm. What are they doing? And then we take the 2007 input-outputs table to try to infer the implied demand of those industries, because we know basically that if there is a pharmaceutical firm, that it will require chemical substances as inputs. So now we look at whether there's an SEZ that is dominated by pharmaceutical firms, and we then look whether this is something that would be benefiting the local firms that are specializing in those chemical substances, right? To kind of have the upstream components here. So with such a method, we're trying to estimate whether the firms inside of SEZs, so the ones that were before and then moved inside an SEZ, are benefiting from the structure through these input-output linkages, and the same for the indirect effects. And what we find here, maybe to some extent, surprisingly, is that basically when we are looking at the benefits on employees, on employment and sales through input-output linkages among firms that are inside SEZs, we see that indeed those positive effects on employment and sales mainly seem to materialize indeed through for firms that are seemingly providing inputs to the other firms in the SEZ, right? So that kind of, I mean, it's not surprising that they kind of co-locate for a reason. You don't have an ice cream, well, maybe you have an ice cream store and a chemical factory for the workers, but it's not a material input for that, of course. But in principle, we see some like input, output, and supply chain co-location that seems to be one important channel for the direct effects on sales and employees. When we're looking at the indirect effects, it's we were a bit surprised that there are no supply chain, like no like very strong evident supply chain spillovers there. But basically, when we look a bit, when we think about the result a bit more, it means that this is not the sole channel through which these benefits are materializing. So what we see is basically that the indirect effects on employment and sales are not related systematically to input-output relationships, but they seem to originate more generally from maybe agglomeration economies, but maybe also second tier or maybe more complicated input-output linkages that we are not effectively mapping with our very simple measure here. Right, so this is one channel, and we basically conclude from this that there is some evidence that input-output linkages matter for the benefits to materialize, but not necessarily for the spillovers. Then, of course, just to maybe double check that SEZ, being in an SEZ is beneficial for firms also fiscally to alleviate a bit their financial constraints. We ran a regression on the probability of a firm to get credit. There's also a variable basically in our data set, in our firm level data set, how much credit a firm has, and we can from this develop a measure on the probability of getting credit, and we see that mainly only basically firms that are inside of an SEZ have a positive correlation here, and those outside not necessarily. That's also just to emphasize that this is, of course, also a potential channel here. And then finally, we want to look at the technology gap, and that might also be very interesting when it comes to policy designs. It's not, I think, we cannot draw too strong conclusions from the results, but basically what we are trying to do, we want to know where those multinational enterprises that are locating in special economic zones are actually coming from, and we rank their origin countries by GDP per capita to have basically a ranking of the technological sophistication of the expected technological sophistication of those and the knowledge of those multinationals, and we have an above and a below median sample eventually, because we can see SEZs where either the high income or the lower income multinational enterprises are dominating. And we then re-estimate our equations to see what happens in terms of labor productivity, because this is about productivity effects and adoption, we can see that whenever there's an SEZ where multinationals are predominantly from high income country, like from the highest income countries, then there's no significant effect on labor productivity. But whenever we have firms that are from relatively lower income countries, I think developing countries is not the proper term here. It's just less than those. So then in that case, we see larger productivity effects. And this could be an indication that technological distance between the local firms, which are of course closer to those lower income country multinationals, that they have an easier time to transfer knowledge and technology than firms that are coming from very high income countries. Maybe just a qualifier, because I already discussed at length with Don this interpretation. There can also be other reasons for this. In particular, it can be that there are sectoral differences between firms from those and those countries. So maybe there's a different culture of sharing knowledge, or a different there are some sectors, I think, where secrecy dominates patenting. So there might be different cultures across sectors, but also there can be cultures across countries in terms of their willingness to share knowledge and technologies. So we have not investigated this, but so far we say that it matters, at least to some extent. It seems to matter to some extent where the multinationals are coming from, whether we can observe productivity effects or not. I think this we can say from this slide. Okay, so I think I would then conclude, just to summarize maybe, and to say that and to repeat that special economic zones are, I think, a particular popular policy tool nowadays in developing countries and emerging economies to facilitate technology and knowledge transfer. We focus on the case of Vietnam and try to disentangle the direct and indirect exposure of firms to special economic zones, finding overall positive effects on employment and sales. We're not looking at firms at cross-firm dynamics. We find that labor productivity is sometimes positively affected, but sometimes not affected, and there can be some obstacles indeed to make this impact here also to materialize more robustly, which can be input-output linkages, but also the type of firms that are coming to those special economic zones. But despite of this, we think also that local agglomeration is playing a role, and this would be something to also explore in further research, and maybe also to conclude overall, to give maybe a conclusion on has it been a success or not. So far, our findings seem to suggest that the SEZ programs and Vietnam have been working relatively well, which is also in line with the evidence on labor market dynamics by the paper that I have referred you to in the beginning of my talk. So yeah, I think this is the end of my presentation, and I thank you very much for coming and for your attention.
Thank you very much for Professor Mao. So that will conclude the presentation. However, if anyone has a question, you are free to continue asking him. And if not, have a great rest of your day.
Maybe I'll ask first. So how common is it for formal firms in Vietnam to hire like informal workers?
Well, this is not part of this study.
No, so you are evaluating impacts on hiring more and more employees, right? But
Yeah.
But I'm not sure like if it's common that formal firms also hire informal workers that are not registered. Then that might be.
No, I cannot say much about it. I can tell you that it's not allowed to informally hire people officially, but I can suspect that since this other paper finds an increasing formalization of the labor market, that there exists informal labor. Whether this is very widely spread in manufacturing activities. I don't know. Maybe there's more sectoral differences, but honestly, I don't know to what extent this. Yeah, I don't know much about the extent or the characteristics of this. Although generally, whenever we are studying developing countries, I think the informal sector always plays a big role, because of course there are certain incentives and circumstances that try maybe people also to actively select informal jobs over formal jobs for various reasons. But in the case of Vietnam, I cannot tell you much about that. Yeah.
Can you comment like in general about these like economic zones programs, like if FDI in Thailand was like reduced in the past decades? So the question is that is the study can generalize to other countries, or is it actually like zero-sum games? If the Vietnam is so successful, it may be the cause of, you know, the less successful in the Thailand policy.
No, I think it's a bit too early to generalize. I think the evidence is still very eclectic and the literature also. So we know that in some countries it works well, but in most countries it doesn't seem to work very well. And what is very difficult to understand is why it works or why it does not work. It seems to depend indeed on the policies and on the incentives, right? So you have to get the right firms that are willing to share knowledge. There are sometimes very surprising obstacles that no one expects, but I'm aware of a study. I think it's more a case study for a special economic zone in Myanmar, where Japanese and Korean firms are locating, and there's very little communication between the local staff and local employees and the managers, because the managers are not willing to learn the local language and English is not good enough. So there's just no communication because it feels awkward and it's too difficult and takes too long. So sometimes just language is also a barrier, because if you communicate a lot with a middle manager or a higher manager from a multinational, you learn a lot, which would be one channel, like maybe labor mobility to move in and out. So they're very, very intricate and different channels through which this transfer takes place. And there's no, I think so far there's no general comment that can be made on what really works and what really does not work. Yes, and that's why I think in the case of Vietnam there are many things that play a role, of course. One is I think that it's in a way the design is a bit similar to that in China, and we haven't looked into the contribution of Chinese multinationals into this effect, but it could actually also be that there has been some diversion of FDI from China to Vietnam, because there's some cultural similarity, of course, and also legal similarities, which make it maybe also easy for MNEs to adapt to this new environment, which might have been a bit harder when they came to Thailand. But this was also a different time in Thailand. So generally, I think the circumstances are in this sample nowadays a bit different then. Yeah, but it's a complicated story and I don't have an answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I think your spillover effect seems to be very interesting. Though the firm that have indirect effect, I think if you not sure if you have establishment of the firm, like the new firm that just moved in versus the firm that has been there even beginning at the beginning or even before the SEZ. I mean, those would be totally different in terms of one might have some selection, right? The one just moved in versus the one that already been there since the very beginning. Yeah. So I mean, having that perhaps can distinguish between the two type of mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have plant data. That's a bit the problem. We just know whether a firm is registered, whether a firm has a tax ID, right? Typically, a plant does not. So if a firm is like an administrative entity that has to pay taxes, to the government, and that's what we identify. We don't know where the plans are, and that's why it is a bit difficult to disentangle. But based on the firm that we observe, we know that some firms have been moving into SEZs and others not. And on that respect, we know that those who kind of remain outside based on their registered address, we treat those as the indirectly exposed ones. And there we find the effects. And I think that's, as far as I know, the most that we can do at the moment in terms of identification. So yeah, maybe it's a good idea to think a bit harder about what else can be at work there. Clearly, it can be that a firm remains registered outside and and operates a plant inside. But this depends also on SEZ regulations, to what extent this is actually allowed, or there we would have to look into this a bit more. Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I have to think a bit more about it. Thanks.
And if I can have another question, so in terms of the mechanism, so you mentioned SEC can have combination of several things, more access to funding, preferential treatment, or even the area of SEC itself that could have more infrastructure relative to others. Those stories, can you try perhaps to describe?
Yeah, well, I have shown you all that we have so far, right? I mean, I think there's more we can do. Whether we can disentangle the relative contributions of various channels to the overall effect, I think that would be interesting to know. And indeed, also like infrastructure would play a role there.
And the firm that have access to funding versus the treatment firm that have funding access versus the treatment firm that do not have. But still, there are some selection.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We have to bring this together into a nice package so that it's a bit clearer where the different mechanisms are coming from. But these are basically a few that we could easily implement and check. And there's a bit more to discuss there. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you again. Thanks so much for your questions, Asim.
Opportunity ของ